Hi, I'm Zoe Williams, columnist for The Guardian. Tonight, I am delighted to be talking to Nova Reid, who is an anti-racism campaigner and educator. Her new book, How to Be a Good Ally, urges its readers to become active allies against racism. It looks at structural racism in a British context and is a guide for those looking for a clearer understanding of racial injustice and white privilege. But it is above all concerned with individual action, how we recognise racism in ourselves and can become actively anti-racist. Hi, Nova, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi Zoe.
Before I ask my first question, we have been sent lots of questions from you and the audience. Thanks for those. So I'm going to talk to Nova for the first 40 minutes or so, and in the last section, I'll be asking your questions. So thank you again, and hello.
Hello.
Nova, welcome. I'm going to take my glasses off now so I can actually talk to you properly. Tell me, first of all, how you got to here from where you thought your career was going. You know, I don't know how long this journey has been even, but let's say just from when you finished school, where did you think you wanted to end up?
Hmm. I mean, if I'm honest, I think there's been a current theme and thread throughout my life. I may not have been able to identify it at the moment, at the time, but it's always been present. And what's coming to mind at the moment is I was an actress and singer for a number of years in a former life. And I remember when I was studying at London Studio Centre, I had to write a dissertation for my degree, and it was entitled We Are Good Enough. And it was a direct response to the misconception that there wasn't enough black talent within the creative space. And so
Yeah.
there's always been a thread of navigating for us and for me, because it was a direct response to having been exposed and experiencing racism at sort of every life event. So it's always been there. But it really punctuated in probably since 2016.
And did you, when you had that kind of experience in drama school and then in the creative field, were you shocked in a way because creative people are meant to be so evolved? You know, that's the last place you would think you would find racism.
Well, I mean, I learned at a young age that that my value as a human being was less because of what I was observing in how people who were treated were black and people who were not black were treated, and my own experiences and exposure to racism from 7 years old. So I always had that as an undercurrent, and it kind of, the only way I can describe it is that it just is what it is. You kind of, well, this is just the way that it is, so you just crack on and get on with it. And it wasn't, and I would have teachers say things like, Nova, you can't play that role, you're black, darling, you're never going to play that role. And so there was always these, I was being fitted into these boxes and squeezed in, but
Yeah.
it was kind of just blasé, and you just accepted it in a strange way. And it wasn't till I was much older and my self-esteem was growing and I realized that actually that's wrong, and no, that's not okay. I felt able to start doing something about it.
And then from acting, you became a businesswoman. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a few steps in between that. So from acting and dancing, I had an injury, and that injury led me to retrain in mental well-being. And it was that I spent about 10 years working in mental health. And I think that really was a firm foundation for the work that I do now and getting interested in human behavior.
It's so interesting because you don't talk extensively in the book about your work in mental health, but it clearly informs so much of the way you even hold a conversation. You know, the way to, and there's something almost therapeutic in the way you write. You know, it's like there's no point coming from a place of judgment because people will just shut down. So
Mm.
everything is extremely well, it is quite therapeutic, interestingly. But were you a therapist, and was that work something that pushed you further into this kind of the analysis, especially of kind of the inherited trauma of racism?
Well, it didn't push me into the trauma of racism, but I did an introductory counselling course. So I did psychotherapy initial training, and that training, I think, is about, I mean, it may have changed now, but back then I think it was about 4 years. And I didn't do the whole course, partly because I was working for an organisation who paid for it at the time, and just to weave in some of the casual racism, my manager at the time said, "We're not going to pay for you to complete the course because then you'll be more qualified than me." So there was a whole thing there, but I also at that time was doing lots of training, and I did NLP, I did neuro-linguistic programming, and I did lots of other types of training in mental health as well. So I had a bit of a mix, and I was training to learn how to help support people who were experiencing mental vulnerability. So that was anything from generalized anxiety right through to psychosis and schizophrenia. So you have to have a very specific set of skills to be able to support people who are going through that kind of vulnerability. And what I found when I was working in mental health was that underneath the labels that therapists, caregivers were so keen to give people, it was the same theme. I mean, yes, without a doubt, medication can sometimes help people, but it was always around low self-esteem, low self-worth, and unworthiness. And regardless of who I was working with, those themes and also not belonging came up over and over again, and they're key themes within anti-racism as well.
Yeah. And there is, and it does, in a sense, the kind of mental health field reflects back to you the kind of injustices that maybe you don't want to think about in society, simply because it does, so much of mental illness is informed by trauma, and so much trauma is in as you say, microaggressions, but also just the kind of persistent aggression or unbelonging.
Yes. Yeah. And persistent exposure to some kind of social suffering. So that's what I mean. The themes were the same over and over again. And so, yeah, I've taken a foundation of what I learned when I did some initial training in psychotherapy and then went on to do more training in mental health. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you feel from that kind of, did that make you feel more like you wanted to be an activist and campaigner, or did it kind of spur some more interior kind of discoveries?
Well, you absolutely cannot work in any kind of capacity as a caregiver without looking at your own stuff. I just don't. I worry about anyone who's not looking at their own stuff because it will come up. We're human, so you have to go through something. You have to go through your own therapy. You have to have something called clinical supervision, which is a form of therapy to support people who are experiencing mental vulnerability, and that used to happen every 2 weeks. So I've always been engaged in some kind of therapy, either because of my job or personally. So it's just part of the essence of what I do and who I am. But I never planned to be an anti-racism activist, Zoe. It was never in my plan. It was not a career plan. It wasn't something that I particularly like. I didn't want to do it. It came to me. And yeah, it feels like a calling to serve something greater than me. And I was like, I kept moving away from it because it's not easy. It's not easy work. And I get exposed to so much nonsense. And I kept moving away from it and going off on different journeys to do things that are more nourishing or joyful. And I kept getting pulled back to it. And I was like, right, now I know why every single set of skills that I have brought me to this moment. Like I have to do this work. I have to do it.
Yeah. And in a way, I mean, do you feel like before you started on the therapeutic work, all one's instincts are to minimize injustice in order to have an easy life. It's just like a natural instinct. But if you're really looking deeply into yourself and what's going on, it becomes impossible, presumably, to minimize.
Yeah, and that's what it was. It was like it was overwhelming, and it just became so loud, and there was just something in me. It was like I cannot tolerate this anymore, and I will not tolerate this anymore. And I need to do something that's within my capacity to do. And I thought, I can see what's going on, and there are ways that I think I can serve in a meaningful way. And whilst I have the capacity to do it, I will serve.
And so how did we get from there to your first TED Talk? Because TED Talks, obviously, they don't all have the same unbelievable footprint as the most famous. But if they do come off, if they do ignite imagination, they are extraordinarily powerful, globally
Yeah,
powerful.
yeah. So again, a synchronicity. I was delivering a workshop at an event for Lufthansa city centre, and there was somebody in the audience who coordinates TED events, and they contacted me afterwards and said, "I saw your talk, and I think you'd be brilliant on a TED stage. And would you consider submitting and talking about more of what you did in that event for TEDx Frankfurt?" And so I said, "Oh, okay then." So they kind of headhunted me, and I said yes, and the rest is history, really.
And that must have felt a bit like karma for you, because when you describe those corporate training programs you've given, they sound absolutely excruciating. You know, companies trying to give themselves an ethics wash at the expense of your time, and then being disrespectful as you try and
Yeah,
teach them what they say they want to learn. I mean, is
yeah. I
that?
mean, I've been in some really, really hostile and emotionally violent environments. And as a result of that, I have to adapt how I work. And I often say no more than I say yes now. But I think the beauty in the event that I was doing with Lufthansa was the person who booked me knew me or was recommend. So I think somebody recommended them to me, and the person that recommended them I trust implicitly. And I thought, well, they've got to be a company that cares about this stuff, otherwise they wouldn't put me in an unsafe space. And I really enjoyed it, and it was, people who wanted to talk about race and wanted to do better. And as a result of that, you get a more impactful and more meaningful event, and that led to the TED talk as well.
So when you just to like, I was really struck on almost on page two. By page two of
Wow.
your book, I was really struck by how closely it describes the experience of being a kind of well-meaning but not particularly good ally. And you
Mm,
know, describe how people fail by kind of disengaging or being intermittent or staying in their lane, or just simply thinking that since their intentions are good, then they must be doing good things, but not actually doing good things. And
yeah.
you begin on language. How do we describe race? How do we describe it? Do you use BAME? Do you use people of color? And you say that you actually, that those terms don't work for you. Can you tell me more about the language that you kind of want people to choose and use, and not feel so hedgy around?
Well, I think, as long as people aren't using racist slurs, like, I think the best way to approach it is to not get too stuck in right words to say, because
Right.
we have our own preferences. Like, I describe myself as black. Someone else might describe themselves as a person of color. Like, that term doesn't resonate with me. And I
Right.
think it's just asking people, what's your preference? Or just mirroring the language that they use and mirroring it, and just surrendering to the fact that language changes and it evolves, and a terminology right now might be okay, and in 6 months time it might move on.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And do you think there's something about, I mean, I sometimes feel like the people policing the language aren't the same people as are affected by the language. And the policing, there's something strategic about, it's almost like, to use a really extreme example, it will be Nigel Farage telling you can't say anything anymore. Whereas, there's a kind of instrumental policing, so that a
Yes.
kind of racist figure can make everybody else feel that it's very easy to get things wrong, so that the conversation closes.
Yeah, and it's a great tactic for diverting from talking about race. And so a quote from the late Toni Morrison is coming to mind, like, the very function of racism is distraction. And so for me, this backing and forthing over language is a distraction, because while we're backing and forthing over language, we're not actually addressing the issues at hand. And I think, actually, if we're just open to asking, preference or just mirroring what's in front of us, and also being open to apologizing and correcting if we do get it wrong or say something that somebody doesn't like, and just moving on.
Yeah. So you describe really movingly this moment after George Floyd's death, when you were completely inundated and people sort of wanted, just the kind of barest amount of contact with you as a credential in their own kind of anti-racist profile. And it struck me as something that was actually very telling about the kind of wider political and corporate response to Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movements at the moment, that there's this kind of really sudden rush to be an ally, to be a visible ally, with no kind of with none of the invisible allegiance work done beforehand. But can you tell me more about that, and from your perspective, and how, and whether that's a complete picture of
it? I mean, yes, it was such a horrible time, a really difficult time for many people for different reasons. But I described that in my book as feeling like I was being eaten alive by a pack of wolves. And it just felt like everybody wanted a piece of me at the same time. And it wasn't because they necessarily cared about doing this work in a meaningful way. It was more about, this situation is making me feel really uncomfortable. I don't want that feeling anymore. You need to alleviate that discomfort for me by giving me what I want right now. And of course, that's all extraction. There's nothing about that action that's anti-racist. It's more about alleviating discomfort and guilt so that they can be seen to be doing something, or not look bad for not having done something sooner. And underneath that, there might be a desire to help, but that was not the driving factor for that specific type of behavior.
Yeah. And your book does create a lot of space, I think, for people to have realizations and feel guilty about them and kind of move through them.
Yes.
And can you just talk to me about the experience you've had with students, where you can kind of tell that they're getting there when they recognize their own discomfort?
Yeah, so I've run an online anti-racism course since 2018, and so I have I still call them students, even though many of them have graduated, because they go back to the beginning and they unpack more layers, and the work is never really done. But it's what I like to call these penny dropping moments, where suddenly there is a physical reaction in your body, and there's just something that you realize, and then another, there's been a layer that's unpeeled, and there's a knowing, I've joined the dots. That's what that was about. Oh my gosh, I've done that. I need to atone for that and make an apology and understand this a bit more. And that's constant for them. They're always unraveling. Even recently, last week or a couple of weeks ago now, someone was having a real difficult exchange with family, and they weren't getting through. And I said, how are you approaching the conversation? Are you approaching the conversation from a place of self-righteousness, Ari, I know all this stuff now, or are you approaching it from a place of curiosity? And they were like, oh, I don't think it's self-righteousness, but I feel really defensive. And I said, lean into the defensiveness, because there's some truth in that. Like it's there. And then after some more unpacking, they were like, yeah, it's coming from self-righteousness and feeling like I'm better than them. And I'm like, you're never going to bring anyone in on the journey from that place.
Yeah, but it's as you say, it's a very difficult, and you describe this really closely, that a lot of kind of liberals or kind of right-thinking white people are ventriloquizing all social racism onto a kind of hard out group, which basically consists of, BNP members and Tommy Robinson, and experiencing their own hatred of those people as an anti-racist credential, well, tell me, is it?
I mean, it's so easy to condemn overt racism. Like, of course, it's easy to do that, and like, it's that you would expect human beings that care about one another would condemn that, and as the right thing to do. But to me, that's not anti-racist action. It's I say it a lot in my work. It's the bare minimum. It's like, it doesn't. Of course, you're going to condemn something that's overt if that doesn't align with your values, and you're not a right-wing extremist. Of course, that's behaviour is going to disgust you. But how does that actually help tackle racism? It doesn't. It doesn't. Just making a sort of comment to declare that their behaviour is disgusting. It's like, how does it help, other than just stating a fact?
And do you feel like the kind of spurt of self-righteousness it gives you is actually a block on your kind of evolution as an ally?
Yes. Yes, because it's far, and I'm going to caveat this, because I'm not saying, like, people who have right-wing views and cause harm in that way aren't dangerous and problematic, because they are, but in terms of numbers, they're not the majority. So what it does, it deflects and it moves us away, it absolves us from looking at ourselves and saying, well, what is it? And this is a question I love to ask my students. What is it in their behavior that is also present in yours?
Yeah.
And that might be, on one end of the spectrum, not believing Black people when they say they've experienced racism. And so, yeah, it's confronting. But, in this work, you have to look at parts of your behavior that might not be pretty.
Yeah. I mean, I was very interested because you touch on, for instance, the government's recent report on racism in the UK and its finding that racism doesn't exist in the UK. And it really gave me a glimpse, but it was a fleeting glimpse of how painful it is to think you're going in one direction and then suddenly find that you're going in it, that we're not going in a direction towards equality. We're not on a steady march towards treating each other better.
On the one hand, it would be funny if it wasn't so trauma-inducing and painful, because it's so ludicrous, because there's so much data and evidence, historical fact, that points to the direction that, we orchestrated so much genocide in our history. It's still impacting us socially and economically today, and it shows in disparities in healthcare, in outcomes at school, in criminal justice. But for people who genuinely don't believe that there's racism in Britain, they'll just think it's because Black people don't work hard enough, or they're not taking advantage of opportunities, and that there's something inherently wrong with Black people, which of course is the racism. But it goes back to this distraction. Like, to me, that's a distraction. There are so many reports and statistics and evidence, so much evidence of social suffering that's happening. And while the government's trying to cover their ears, I'm more interested in doing something to help, and also looking at, the human rights and racism. What's it called? Black People, Racism and Human Rights Report, which was commissioned by the House of Commons just a few months before that report that we're talking about was published, that shows that government and every successive government have shown a seismic failure in their ability to tackle systemic racism. So I'm more interested in addressing it than debating it.
And do you feel that sometimes, because I mean, this current government, I don't think it's extreme or excessive to say they're far more bigoted than any government I've known in my adult life, certainly. Do you feel like, do you ever look at it and think, oh my God, that is reflective of the country underneath? It is actually worse than we thought.
Yes. Yes. To me, none of it is a surprise. Like, if we look back in history, like, we've always had racist governments. Racism was embedded in law by the English. So, like, to me, nothing has changed in that respect. It's just taken on, a mutated format. So it's no surprise. But I'm like, right, how do we navigate this? And part of that is drawing awareness to these sorts of things. Because yes, the government is bigoted, and they have always been. And yeah.
And there are kind of many insights into kind of racism in a medical context, which I think people will find really, really kind of eye-opening and troubling and surprising, actually, because you just don't see the case built so systematically that, on the one hand, you've got Black people's actual kind of sensitivity to pain being disbelieved, and then on the other hand, you've got Black midwives who don't get a lunch break, or Muslim midwives who don't get a lunch break in Ramadan because they don't need one. I mean, they're like unbelievable instances, both kind of anecdotal and data driven, which I wonder whether that, I mean, I'd be interested in your view on whether you think people are aware of this, and if not, why not?
Well, certainly some people are aware of it, and that includes medical professionals. Charity Birthrights are actually doing an investigation into racism in healthcare, particularly with gynecology and maternity care at the moment. So I think that will be coming out at some point next year. So it'd be interesting to see what the findings are. I'm a board member there. So it's certainly not, people are aware, and more people are trying to shine a spotlight on what's going on. But again, what happens is when we've only become accustomed to associating racism with a right-wing extremist who is violent, who is of a certain, caliber of human, and only that, when we say, well, actually, there's racism in the NHS, the NHS has been put on a pedestal, just like the royal monarchy and the police to a certain extent. They're heroes. So when you try and challenge it, the first thing is, no, they're not. And then we go into this rejection and this defensiveness, and we're not actually addressing it and reducing harm, because we're more interested in image perception rather than actually, a lot of unaddressed racism or even conscious racism is happening, and we need to take steps to address it so that we can reduce harm to people that we're supposed to be caring for.
I mean, what I found really interesting was that I think, exactly as you say, we have the NHS on a pedestal, and we can't really brook any poor behaviour within it, particularly not behaviour which is motivated by a politics or a worldview that we hate. Yeah. But that kind of valorization of the NHS is part of British exceptionalism, which is also part of what makes us think that we're not racist.
Exactly.
Or if we are, then we're definitely not as bad as Americans.
That's the one that makes me laugh the most. I was like, oh my gosh, we getting to a pretty low point if we're now comparing ourselves to America as a benchmark. Forgetting that America was also a British colony. Where did they learn that behaviour from in the first place? I think there is a history of collective shame that we haven't confronted yet, because we defend our position so much, and we shut up and put up appearances and keep calm, carry on, all of that stuff, and hashtag just be kind, meaning that we don't take any accountability or responsibility, and that's been historical. So much harm was caused across the globe under British colonial rule. And it's not been addressed. It's not been acknowledged. There's been no atonement for what happened, particularly with centuries of enslavement and Britain's firm hand in that. There's been absolutely no atonement, no acknowledgement, no reparations. And I think until we're able to be honest about our collective history, we'll keep carrying this collective shame, and it will get in the way of us. It will just get in the way of us making any progress.
Yeah. Can you talk me through the epigenetics of trauma, the kind of inheritance of trauma and the trauma born of racism from one generation to another? Because this, again, was an unfamiliar but very believable idea.
Yeah, there's there's what I found really interesting in my research for the book. So I started writing The Good Ally in 2018. It was called something else back then, but I actually started writing it and obviously researching before that. And in all my research, considering the elongated period of time that slavery and the transatlantic slave trade took place, there's very little studies on the impact of that elongated period of time, which is interesting in itself. But there are studies that we can draw parallel to. I think the most recent study shows that trauma can be passed down up to 14 generations, which is huge.
Wow, that's huge.
There was other. You can't actually get your head around that, and it makes so much sense to me. It makes so much sense to me. And there are more recent studies which draw parallels to people who were involved in September the 11th, and how trauma can be passed on from people who were exposed to September the 11th and also pregnant at the time. When they gave birth, they had increased cortisol levels in their system. So there is a lot that shows that trauma is passed down from womb to womb.
And that's that makes the act of being a good ally even more vital, because it's almost that if you're passing down trauma from one generation to another, you're also passing down privilege from one generation to another. So there's no such thing as being a bystander, really.
No, because, and I use a kind of metaphor, and I say, like, this stuff is in the fabric of our DNA, but it literally is in our DNA. Like, you have to like, this kind of violence didn't just happen for a year. It went on for centuries, where it was legalized to treat Black people worse than animals. And so you have to lose part of your humanity to either be involved with that, to witness it, and to have that passed down from generation to, like, you're not going to get away unscathed from that. And there's going to be behaviors that we have learned that are passed down because of that, on all sides of the coin.
Yeah. One bit I was really chastened by, but particularly on the question of slavery, but on many questions actually, was the kind of even as histories are told and rewritten of the period, Black activists fighting for themselves are constantly sidelined or erased altogether in favor of white saviors. And it's just so extraordinary, because that should have been really obvious to all of us,
Yeah.
But I don't remember questioning whether it was entirely William Wilberforce who ended slavery.
That's the story that's told. I'm just laughing because I remember Carla recounts a moment in the book where he challenged a teacher when he was a young boy at school, who was saying that William Wilberforce ended slavery, and Carla puts his hand up. Younger Carla puts his hand up and says, "What, miss, all by himself?" And even him at this young age thought, something doesn't add up. This was a global economy making enterprise. How could one individual be responsible for that? And then, of course, you hear about these resistance warriors, leaders, activists. So many were Black women, and the stories are untold, undocumented, or erased. And so it was really important for me to share more about some of those stories in my book, which I learned from a historian called Stella Dadsey, who used to be civil rights activist here in the UK. And so I'm trying to raise awareness of more voices that go unknown and unheard of.
And do you look at movements like, bringing down this Colston statue, like the kind of, there is in the British Black Lives Matter movement something that is quite distinct from the American one. I think it doesn't have that kind of same energy of, they have a kind of defund the police, and we don't really have that as a priority, and they have a kind of a history of they have a kind of civil rights history which is different to our protest history. Do you think the movements are cross-pollinating really well, or do you think in a way the British Black Lives Matter movement is being attacked for being for being Marxist when it actually isn't.
I think it depends on who you talk to. They'll always, it will be viewed in one. It just depends on who you're talking to and how it's viewed. I mean, I've heard lots of conversations about defund the police over here, and there's a real misunderstanding about what that means. It means redistributing where funding is given. Like social services is really underfunded, and actually, if we gave more money to social services, so we could do more prevention work, then maybe we wouldn't be having to spend so much on policing if we're actually helping people deal with their social suffering in the first place and preventing harm and all of those things. So, I mean, the whole statue thing, I think what's more important is educating people on why we're pulling the statue down, what this person, the history relating to this person, and helping people really understand, rather than just getting caught up on the metal, because again, it just feels like a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me like I would have thought it would be like kicking down an open door, that conversation, especially like really kind of people who are only famous for slave trading. So some of these kind of industrialists had other things, like, I don't know, a cotton industry, but
Yeah.
there was this kind of body of hagiography around people whose only real mark was violence, and I would have thought that it was a very easy case to make. And I've been surprised by the and kind of shocked by how basic the arguments are.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just agreeing with you. I've got nothing to add to that. Yes, they're very basic. And I do talk about this in The Good Ally. There is a real childlike element to navigating racism and having cross-racial conversations about race. And there is a lot of research that shows us that if trauma gets stuck in our body, then whatever age we were when we experienced that trauma, when that's activated, we go back to that age. And so there's a real childlike and infantile quality, and sometimes a real lack of emotional maturity to have these cross-racial conversations, and that too gets in the way of us actually addressing it, because sometimes we can't even name things as they are, as descriptive words, without people spinning.
Yeah. I was really, again, chastened, it's a word I'm going to keep coming back to, by the section on different racisms and different people of different colors experiencing racism differently. And once you say, it's different to be a South Asian man to being a black woman, it's different to be a Japanese woman to being a Yugoslavian woman, and that doesn't diminish anybody's experience, but it is different. It's very obvious. You can see with your own eyes that the racism are different. And I wonder whether the reason the reason we collectively avert our eyes is recognizing the difference makes it look like we understand the racism, and when we refuse, and it makes it look like you're colluding with the racism if you recognize the gradations of it.
Interesting. I mean, that's not it's not an assumption I would make. But certainly if that's a strong feeling, then yeah.
You
It's a strong
therapizing
feeling. No, but it's not, it's just the thought. It's not fact.
Yeah. But it is very interesting, and I do think it's important to recognize different racism applying to different people. But it's something that people don't tend to recognize, and is almost a taboo conversation.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I choose to centre anti-blackness in the book. Not only because anti-blackness is the birthplace of racism, but yes, Africans are the only human community where it was written in law embedded by the English, that rule that Africans were subhuman. and no other human community has been made subhuman by law. And as a result of that, when we start dissecting stats and when we start looking at data, and we see people who are more impacted socially disproportionately, you tend to see that it's Black people more. And you're like, well, of course, because our history is different. And it's not saying that it's always Black people, but it disproportionately is.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm going to go to questions from the audience.
Ooh.
What is the best way to talk about this with children, and what are the particular what are the particular issues raised when you're thinking of it as a parent or as an adult in relation to children?
I think actually the problem is adults overthink it.
Right.
Some of the most easeful conversations that I've had about race and racism have been with children, because they don't have the baggage and the judgment and the shame and the guilt and all of the meaning making that goes behind it, and the awkwardness. It's just easeful with children, and half of the time the awkwardness is actually a sign of our own discomfort around talking about it, rather than actually anything going on with the children. But it's age appropriate conversations, and it's, people often say, well, I don't want to talk about this stuff with my children, I don't want to ruin their innocence. But children learn nonverbal cues from as young as 7 months old, and they're already learning in society how people are treated and where they are in relation to that. And by 3 years old, they're already exhibiting racial bias. So it's something that we need to get on top of. We live in a racist society. And it's one of the reasons I've written a whole chapter about it in the book, and what we can start to do about it.
I mean, another thing about the kind of, I think that there's an inflection point of having children or being around children, that you see how precious their trust is in a way that you don't see in adults anymore, and you kind of want to, and it makes you want to be truthful but also want to be protective. And I kind of picked that up a lot in your tone, actually, that you want to be truthful and you want to be protective, but that ability to make mistakes isn't really there with a kid.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about, we have to role model not knowing.
Right.
There's this feeling that we have to know everything, and know what that, if a child says something that's racist, or that invokes embarrassment, there's this perception that you have to know exactly what to say, and like, we're human, sometimes we don't, and I think it's okay. Like, I don't know, let me have a think about it, and let's have a chat later. Why don't we go and find out together? There are, role model not knowing, and also for people who are raising Black children and children of color, so often, like, racism is brought to their door. So you then have to have a dialogue, like, it's brought to their door so early on, with young people being bullied in the playground from as young as 3 years old, sometimes younger. So, like, we have to deal with it in the same way we start talking about road safety, and safety with strangers, with children from they're very, very young. We should be doing the same about racism and being kind to one another.
I really loved the story in your book about your friend who was on the bus when the father and son got racially abused, and it was so interesting, and it was so clear. It was so like, this is what my friend did, and this is why that was the right thing to do. So can you describe that?
Yeah, so I do this a lot in the book, to give the reader real day examples of what this looks like, and then I dissect it. Someone recently read my book, described it as almost surgical. So I almost dissect what's going on and say, this is this, this is this, this is this, and this is what you can do about that, and this is what my interviewer did. And she witnessed racism, and she challenged it, and she also placed herself so that she moved the people experiencing racism away from the perpetrator to a space of safety, whilst also continuing to challenge behaviour. And also the people that experienced racism was a grown adult and also a very young boy on his way to a superhero party. And of course, you don't understand that that's racism when you're that young. You just think, why is that person being mean to my mummy or daddy or my parent? And what's wrong with, why are they being mean to me? And they internalize that. And so what she did was spend some time talking to the little boy about the superhero party that he was going to and what his favorite superhero character is. And so distraction is often a good technique as well, depending on the environment that you're in, and can also diffuse and offer support. So yeah.
So I found the people who sent the questions, by the way, and that question about children was from Sandra Nelmes. So thank you very much for that. Michelle, how do I encourage my white colleagues and friends to take an active role in anti-racism? I mean, this is the $1 million question, right?
It's a $1 million question, and that's why I wrote the book, really. It comes down to, like, I'm past the point of debating my humanity with anyone anymore. So if you're in a situation where you have to convince somebody who's a friend as to why engaging in anti-racism is the right thing to do, then I think there's a conversation about whether that friendship is one that is serving you or not. And it's just bringing it back to real lack of empathy. And, this is about all of us. And there are people, experiencing racism as trauma. And there's lots of things we can do to help each other live in a more honest way, and a more human way. And, I'd really like you to be part of that. And, here's some things that can really help. And if there is a rejection, then I just think that at this point, we need to be holding firm boundaries around who we allow to be into our lives or not.
I think there's something as well, if I can just tell you something I really noticed about the book, is that if the way to get people to engage is holding a mirror up to them to show them they're not perfect in such a way as they're not so horrified by the image that they see that they can't look. And that's, there's a great gentleness to the way you approach conversations, which you model both in conversations you describe and the way you write.
Thank you. And I think that takes us back to what we were talking about earlier around the self-righteous piece. Like, people are more likely to engage with curiosity rather than being told. And so that is always an in for me. I'm curious, like, clearly we're friends, I love you, we have a relationship, whatever it might be, and I know you care about humans, so I'm curious as to why it doesn't make sense to me that you still want to use jokes that are harmful to people or do these things that you've been told cause harm. Like, what's that about? And again, I think those kinds of conversations are helpful if it's, people racialized as white calling other people who are white in, but it adds a totally different dynamic when you're Black or a person of color. And, for us, a real important component is preserving our well-being and as surrounding ourselves with people who will fill us up. But yeah, curiosity is a component, and also like role modeling. Like, none of us are perfect, and actually, what is your understanding of what racism is? Because if you think it's the right-wing extremist over here, then we probably need to have a conversation of what racism is systemically and how it can show up in everyday lives and how we can all perpetuate it intentionally or unintentionally. So it's more about us rather than them and us.
Yeah. Jim Breaker asks, what is the most common misconception people have about being an ally? Is it that they're good at it?
That they are one, actually. That they are one. I'm an ally. I think, there is and I talk about why I've called it The Good Ally in the book, so I won't go into it now, but I was very intentional with that title. And I know it speaks to the part of people that want to be good and want to be right. But this isn't about being good or right. It's about being human. And anyone who self-declares that they're an ally usually are the ones who've got the most work to do. Because if you are actually being actively anti-racist in this instance, like, it's role modeled in your behavior, it's role modeled in your language, it's role modeled in how you show up at work, it's role modeled in your parenting. It becomes part of who you are, and you don't need to self-declare it. So I think that's the misconception. Yeah. And also just thinking that you can read a few tips and get it. This is something that you'll be doing for the rest of your life, and unpacking and unpeeling and getting it wrong along the way, and cringing and curling your toes and having shame spirals, and then guilt, and then feeling really joyful. Like, it's a whole thing, and it's for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Serena Longworth Cook wants to know, what are your thoughts on intersectionality? Are minorities benefited more by campaigning on single characteristics, or is there a bigger impact to be had by joining forces and working intersectionally?
It's a really good question, and I'm just taking a moment to just collate. Like, it's a big subject, and I talk about this more in the book as well. I think it's important that, I think what happens when we try and tackle too many things at once is that we end up conflating issues. I think it's really important. So I talk about the fact that I am from a majority British lens, not exclusively, because the nature of what I'm talking about, we go global. But I centre anti-blackness without apology, because so often it goes unaddressed, unknown, erasure of history, erasure of knowledge. And so within that lens, so I will firmly stay on anti-blackness, but within that, I'll talk about, right, so how does this impact people who are living with disabilities and are also Black? How does this impact people who are Black and Muslim? How does this impact people who are Black and queer and disabled, and using that lens? So I'm not moving away from Blackness, but I am bringing in lots of different experiences to show how multiple systems of discrimination can impact people. But it does bring me back that for other people who are campaigning about important issues, one springs to mind, breast cancer. I don't think people would be asking them why they're not talking about testicular cancer or Hodgkin's disease as well. They're all really important things. They're all really important things. And it's not about one being more important than the other. It's like, how can we focus and have the most impact and be intersectional as much as we can without taking away from the focus of what it is that we're talking about? I just think you just have more impact and you're more powerful.
I mean, I love that story about your sister-in-law, who was also, I can't remember where she was from. She was from Czechoslovakia.
Slovak. Yes, Slovakia.
So it's like a really, what was so interesting about the argument is that it's coming from this kind of very intimate place where it's very high stakes. If you're arguing about whether she, as a white Eastern European, could understand the racism you've experienced as a Black woman, then that could go very wrong. If you're in a family, that could be like, that could just explode. And so it had to be treated again very, very gently, but the point was quite emphatic. It's not taking away from your experience to say that my experience is different. And I wonder if that's how different minority groups will eventually find the unison that will increase their strength.
And I think it's very necessary, because the element of white supremacy, and when I say that I mean the system, it wants us divided. So we're enabling it by remaining divided. So that I very much hope that will be the case. But that incident with my sister-in-law didn't happen with one conversation. So I think it's really important to highlight that. Like, it was ongoing. It was an ongoing conversation. She had thinking time. I had thinking time. We were able to come back together and talk about it some more. And so you're building on it and not expecting people to get it in an instant. And then I just think also, the more she's in our family, the more time she's spending with us, the more she's seeing the work that I do. And also, some of the things I'm exposed to, she starts to experience that difference, and then starts to develop discernment about the difference between, well, I'm experiencing xenophobia right now, and that's not the same as racism. Not but, just and. Yeah.
No. I mean, you do talk about about microaggression and exploitation and, inherited trauma, but you don't actually talk very much about kind of, the violent racist abuse that people with a strong anti-racist presence get online. Is that because it would be triggering to do so for others, or is it because you don't dwell, or?
No, I don't. It's not that I don't dwell. I just don't think it's helpful all of the time for me to shine a spotlight on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is a cost to doing this work. There is a cost to me as a Black woman, and a Black woman who has dark skin. And, some of the stuff I get in my inbox and in my emails is disgusting. There is a cost.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just think that's so disgusting. So there's a question from Sunita Harley about challenging the racist behaviours of more senior colleagues at work. And it sounds like that previous question about colleagues and friends, but actually there's a huge component of courage here, or lack of courage. And I noticed it in many of the stories you told with your kind of brushes with corporate events where, people could see that you were being treated badly and just lacked the basic courage. How do we, what kind of an ally are you without courage, and how do you build your courage muscles?
Do you know, there's research that my colleagues at Pern Candola did about racism at work that revealed that actually statistically white people are more likely to call out racism in the workplace than Black people and people of colour. But here's the caveat: they're less likely to call out microaggressions, the kind of subtle racism, the kind of everyday racism, because they're less able to recognize it, or it might be around the discomfort. Right. I think it's multiple things. I think a lack of psychological safety in the workplace, meaning that there is a real fear of retribution. There's going to be an impact to career progression. I might lose my job. I might be sidelined. So there's a real fear of what will be the impact. There's also people just not recognizing racism that's not overt. And there's lack of, some organizations have systems and policy, but they don't follow them when racism is addressed. They more likely want to just sweep it under the carpet, get rid of it quietly, than actually give people who are experiencing racism the human dignity and to take their complaint seriously. So it's multiple things. And I think one of them is lack of knowledge and understanding, and fear of retribution, and therefore a lack of courage to be able to give feedback, to raise awareness and highlight an issue so that it's addressed. But there's this real fear that there will be some kind of retribution for that, and some of that is historical. And people are more likely to deny the racism actually happened than accept that it did and address it.
Yeah. I'm gutted that we've run out of time. I hope we were able to answer some of your questions. I would have liked to go on for another hour. A huge thank you to Nova for a fascinating conversation. We'd love to hear what you thought of the event, audience. When it ends, a very short survey will pop up on your screen. Your feedback will really help us shape our future programme. Guardian Live have much more coming up. Find out more at theguardian.com/Guardian Live. Thanks again to Nova Reid, and good night.